I want to talk a little bit about the different rental costs in Albania. What I basically learned over really the last 2.5 months of renting places in Tirana and then weekend places outside of the city. Really started getting thinking about this when I went on vacation to Durrës for the weekend outside of my home base in Tirana, and I got a little 2-bedroom place on the beach near the beach and saw some of the things that really made me start to wonder, and they became more frequent and more frequent as I was looking through other places. Got some good photos of Durrës. I put a little B-roll up there of the beach and some people walking by, so you don't have to look at my ugliness the entire time that I'm doing this video. Really, you have 3 costs when you're traveling the world. Different costs depending on what your situation is. The first of those would be a tourist cost, and I define that as basically you're renting a place for 3 weeks or less. You're going for a couple days, you're going for a week. Your costs there are basically going to be hotel costs. Even if you go through Airbnb, if you find someone local, you're really not going to save much money, and you're going to actually end up spending more money, much more money than you would if you were in there for the long term, and much more money than you would for the secondary cost. Which that secondary cost is basically what I do, which is a nomad cost. So when I go to a place, I'm going to stay in that country for a month, sometimes 3 months, usually no more than 90 days. And I am going to usually, in most places, get some sort of a discount on there. For instance, if I'm in Southeast Asia, I can negotiate a lesser rate for the place that I'm going to be staying based on being there for a month rather than for a week or two. So in nomad costs, you're able, just in terms of rental, you're able to reduce those costs because people are going to cut you a break most of the time in most countries, because you're going to be staying in a place longer. They're not going to have to turn that over, re-advertise it. They're not going to have to do multiple cleanings because of different people coming in through short terms, and they have some stability there. Then your final cost that you would have would be what I call the expat cost. And that's somebody who's going to be living long-term in a country, a year, 2 years, at a minimum really of 6 months. And when you're willing to commit in most countries to a 6-month lease or a 1-year lease, then you're going to get a huge discount on what you would with the other 2 cases. For example, and a lot of people think this is a bad deal, but approaching the summer in Tirana, I was able to get a 2-bedroom plus a living area, a separate kitchen with 2 balconies for about $608, not too far off from the city center. $608 US a month. Now, that's a much higher cost than you would have as an expat or as a local in the area, but it's a much reduced cost from what you would do if you were just doing overnight rentals or you were doing a week-to-week basis on there. So I was pretty happy with that cost. And by the way, that cost also included all of my utilities because it was through Airbnb originally and then negotiated with the host for the next month. One final cost that you would have, this won't really ever apply to you as a nomad or even as an expat, would be the local cost. And that's what somebody who really is, for instance, an Albanian, living in Albania, living in Tirana, their costs for their rentals are going to be much cheaper than what you are, because they're probably not going to be living in the same areas that you are. They're going to live far outside the city and then commute into work. And once you get way distant in the city to where you're 20-30 minutes commuting during the day, then those costs are going to decrease, but you're going to be in a local neighborhood where there's almost no English and not the facilities that you would want as a remote worker or even as an expat just living overseas. So what I'm going to focus on in this video is going to be the nomad cost, and that is when you're living in a place for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, but less than 6 months, less than 4 months on there. Basically, you're doing long-term travel where you're living in a place for a long time, and then you're moving on to the next country. Now, in Albania, especially in Tirana, getting short-term rentals on a month-to-month basis is very, very difficult. You can try word of mouth, hitting the ground, asking all the local real estate agents, asking basically anybody that you run into, hey, does somebody have a short-term apartment or condominium available for rent? I didn't have much luck with that. I tried that. I talked to different real estate agents. Really, Tirana people are looking for long-term rentals, or if they're not, they pretty much already have it up on Airbnb or Booking.com. One place where I did see some people have some success was in the local expat groups on Facebook. So people would go on there, say that they're looking for a 1-bedroom studio or a 2-bedroom for a short-term rental. They would give the dates that they were going to be doing it, whether that be for 1 month or for a period of 3 months. And occasionally, not very often, but occasionally somebody from the group would pop up and say, hey, I sent you a private message, I have a place available. Or they would say, hey, I know a real estate agent who has somebody moving out. They have it leased, but for your period of time, it would be available for you under that short-term rental contract. So that is some place to try when you first get into a place. A lot of times what people do in Albania, like everywhere else in the world on Airbnb, is they'll rent a place for 2 or 3 nights, see if it's acceptable, and then they'll try to communicate off-platform with the host to see if they can get a better rate. Sometimes that'll work for you, sometimes it won't. When I came here, it wasn't so good because we were approaching the summer months when rent went up. So finally, when you're dealing with short-term rentals in Tirana, Albania, and that's unique from and different from the coast, which I'll talk about really at the end of this video, but you may end up just having to go through Airbnb, doing a month at a time, trying to take it off platform, or looking at bookings.com. Tirana really is not a good place for trying to get those short-term rentals like you'd be able to in some parts of Western Europe, in the United States, Latin America, or even Southeast Asia. There are some things that you need to look out for when you're renting in Albania. Things that in the West are different than they are really throughout Eastern Europe, but especially in Albania. One of those things is when you're looking at an Airbnb or some other listing site and you see it saying that it's a 2-bedroom. That might not be what you think of as a 2-bedroom. So in the United States, when I'm looking at a 2-bedroom apartment listing, I'm thinking I've got 2 bedrooms and probably a living area. Well, in Albania, and again throughout Eastern Europe, a lot of times what they say when they say a 2-bedroom means that you do have a bedroom and then you have a common living area that has a pull-out couch sofa or maybe just a bed in that common living room. When they do advertise in Albania what we would think of as typical 2-bedroom apartments or condominiums, you're looking at what they call a 2+1. In other words, 2 bedrooms plus a living area. Other things to look out for involve the heat and air conditioning. So if you were to get an Airbnb or some other rental, and they advertise that they have air conditioning or heat, well, they probably do have air conditioning or heat. I can almost guarantee it. But that air conditioning unit may only be in the common living area, and your bedroom or your second bedroom might not have any air conditioning whatsoever. And in the summer months, especially in Tirana, it can get pretty hot without air conditioning inside those bedrooms. So if you don't actually look in the pictures and see the aircon units in those bedrooms, you might want to contact the host, talk to the landlord, tour the property yourself and see if they actually have those units for your own comfort. The bathrooms are also a big deal in Albania for Western people. In Albania, in Eastern Europe, I saw this all throughout Southeast Asia. A lot of the bathrooms are what you call wet bathrooms. So you'll have a shower unit without any curtains, without any sort of a cabinet or stall, so that when you take a shower, the water goes everywhere. It goes on the toilet, it gets in the bidet, it gets on the sink. The entire bathroom gets wet. A lot of Westerners don't like that, me included in there. I prefer to have some sort of a cabinet to contain the water so that after I take a shower for the next hour or two, I still have a usable bathroom where I can go in and use the facilities, or somebody else can go in and use those facilities without getting soaking wet. Another thing about the bathrooms is the heating units. For instance, when I went to Durres and I rented a 2-bedroom condominium for the weekend, it also had 2 bathrooms, 1 bathroom for each of the bedrooms. But only one of those bathrooms had an actual hot water heater, so the other bathroom you were basically taking cold showers. So again, look through the pictures when you're looking at Airbnbs, see if they have hot water heaters. In Albania, they're usually hung up on the ceiling so you can see them, or ask your landlord to find out if that's something that's important to you. It is something that's important to me, it's important to my family. Last three things that you need to take into account when you're booking or you're doing a rental contract for short term in Albania. One is lifts or elevators. In Tirana, there are a lot of units that are 7, 8, 9 floors tall, and sometimes when you get there, they don't have any elevator, they don't have any lift. So you've rented that, you come in with all your baggage, and you're carrying those up 5, 6, 7 flights of stairs. So really important to check in the listing, contact the landlord, find out, hey, does this have an elevator? Does it have a lift? So that you're not carrying your bags up and down when you're checking out. Plus you're not getting a ton of exercise that was unwanted every single time you have to go out to eat during the week. Next thing is the trash, especially picking up the trash. In Tirana, they have big dumpsters, garbage bins that you throw your trash in, usually outside of your unit. Usually those are pretty obvious, but in some of the smaller Airbnbs that you would rent off of the main streets, sometimes you'll be walking quite a ways, 2, 3 city blocks, before you get to the area where you can actually dump your garbage. I had gone and looked at a unit in Tirana that we were considering renting, and when I was talking to the host on my way out, I started realizing that I wasn't seeing any dumpsters or any trash bins. And so I asked the landlord, where do we put the garbage out if we decide to rent this place? And he gave me some sort of off the wall, it's down the block, a few blocks, something like that. So I took it on my own to walk down there and find out, and we would have been walking 2 to 3 blocks every single time we wanted to throw our garbage away. Again, that might not be a big deal to you, but when I'm a remote worker, I need to be able to separate my work time from my fun time, and I don't want to be walking blocks at a time just to get rid of garbage. So the final thing that I think that you need to look out for when you're renting in Albania, Tirana, or anywhere else in Albania, is to consider insulation and noise in the units. So a lot of the buildings in Tirana are very old. Some of them go back to the 70s, maybe even the 60s, and they're not very well insulated from the communist times they were built in. And so in some of the places I stayed, we could hear neighbors fighting at all hours of the night, dogs barking, traffic going by, basically people talking in the apartment next door. And if you're trying to do remote work and you get distracted easily, that's really not something that you want to have. I know that in my work, I have to talk to people over the telephone or over Zoom calls or other video meetings, and I really don't need to have them hearing dogs barking next door, inside the room, or neighbors fighting. So one of the places that I looked to rent long-term, which was right across the street from the first place that I got, was so well insulated that the guy went out, the landlord went out to the hallway to close the door and was like, you can scream out here and not hear. And literally once those doors were closed, inside that new modern apartment, you wouldn't hear anything. So go visit the places, talk to the landlords, make sure that it's insulated to fit your needs. Plus, you might want to watch movies at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and you don't want your neighbors calling your landlord or your host complaining because you got the TV set on. Okay, as a nomad going to Tirana, the capital city of Albania, there's really only about 4 areas that you really want to consider renting, and that's because of the proximity of services, the amount of English level that you're going to have, if that's important to you, and just basically your standard of living. So the 4 areas that I've identified, some of them I've lived in, some of them I've just visited. But the first one would be Ruga Kavaha, and that's East Tennessee redneck. I'm sorry if I'm completely mispronouncing that, but it's an area on a road that goes from just where I would call the interstate or the superhighway into the center part of town where Skanderbeg Square is. And in that area, it's extremely safe. It's a very nice neighborhood. You literally can go out at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're not going to have any problems. I never felt uncomfortable. I would let my daughter go out there at night. It's just not a problem. It's extremely safe. In addition, you've got all kinds of grocery stores and restaurants in that area. So literally you're within a 5-minute walk at any time of getting groceries, getting food, getting back to your apartment, any sort of services that you need in that area. Plus, unlike the city center, at night things tend to calm down in that area, and you're not going to have as many bars or nightlife keeping you up at all hours of the morning. And by bus or public transportation, you're about 7 minutes to the city center. If you walk it, you could probably do it in 15 to 20 minutes from there down to Skanderbeg Square. That brings us to the second area of Tirana, which would be the city center in and about Skanderbeg Square, and where all of the different tourist attractions and places that you're going to want to see are going to be. That's a great area. You're going to pay a little bit more money for that area, but you're going to have some advantages. One, you're not going to have to use transportation. You're not going to have to use taxis to get, just to go to the main tourist attractions. You're also going to be right there near the nightlife and the evening entertainment, if that's important to you. And you're going to have a large concentration of Albanians that speak English. As you leave the city center, basically in concentric circles as you go farther and farther out from the city center, the amount of English that you're going to have in your local shops, grocery stores, restaurants, bakeries is going to decrease. It's going to be mostly concentrated amongst the young people in the city center, and the farther and farther out you get, the less English you're going to have, if that's something that's important to you. To me, English is the only language that I speak. I'm not very good at communicating with people that don't have some form of English on there, even though I try. So it makes my life just so much easier when I'm living in areas where I can find somebody that I can communicate with easily and get the things that I want. The third area that a lot of people go to, especially expats, is the Bluku area, which used to be a neighborhood that was really reserved for the communist elite. It was a closed off area, so your normal people during communist times couldn't come there. Now that communism's over and Albania is open and free, anybody can live in those areas. You find some really good, trendy, nice restaurants in that area. You've got all the food that you want to eat, entertainment. A lot of people come in, even if they live outside that area, just for entertainment in the Bluku area. And with that, though, obviously comes more costs. But there's some really good apartments there, some really modernized apartments, and good places that you can stay in the Bluku area. All right, all that brings me to really what my final thoughts are on short-term rental in Albania. And the big one is going to be that Albania is very much a summer culture. You have tourists coming in from all over Eastern Europe, coming down to the beaches, and even to Tirana itself during the summer. So the cost of living as far as short-term rentals is going to go up during the summer. The difference between May in Tirana for a 2-bedroom and June in Tirana is going to be almost $200 a month difference on there. So when you're securing even a long-term contract, you're better off securing it in the late fall or the early spring if you're going to be there throughout the summer, because you're going to get a better price for the same amount of money for those rental contracts. Second thing in my final thoughts is that Tirana is much different from the coastal cities of Albania. So as we're in Tirana, getting short-term rentals month to month is going to be very difficult outside of Airbnb or Booking.com. When you're dealing with the coastal cities, especially outside the summer, you're going to have a better chance of getting those short-term rentals simply because, one, demand is not going to be there. A lot of those cities roll up their streets in the fall and in the early spring because they don't have a lot of people coming there because they are a tourist-dependent economy. They're also, during the summers, used to renting out their places on a short-term basis for people coming in for the weekends or a week at a time for vacation. So if you're looking for a short-term rental and you want to be on the coast, you might have more luck there than you would in Tirana. The things you'd be giving up is the stability of the infrastructure, such as internet, high-speed internet, so that you can work, even brownouts and things like that I've heard of from the coast when you compare that to Tirana. And then finally, wherever you live in Tirana, the costs of your groceries and your restaurants is going to differ. So the farther away you get from the city center, the cheaper that your groceries at your local markets is going to be. And it can be a considerable amount of difference even between the same chain of grocery stores, from downtown in Tirana to just going 2 kilometers outside of the city center. Anyway, those are my thoughts on renting in Albania, specifically in Tirana, because that's where I've had the most experience. I hope that is of somewhat help to you, and I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video.